Welcome to the Lens of History. You are with Luke Herbert, speaking with special guests and placing the microscope on current and historical events.
Welcome, listeners, to this special edition of The Lens of History. And today I'm joined in the studio, and sitting on the couch is author Andrew Carr, and he has written what I think is a very good read, Winning the Peace, Australia's Campaign to Change the Asia Pacific.
Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome, and I've been looking forward to this interview. And by the way, for the sake of the benefit of the listener, the book is published by Melbourne University Press. And just while we are getting started, can you introduce yourself to the listener and how you came to turn your thesis into the book?
Sure, I have to. So I'm a research fellow at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the Australian National University here in Canberra in Australia. I teach a couple of courses on Australian strategic policy, and the book Winning the Peace came from my doctoral thesis. And obviously I had the usual career motives for publishing, but I thought it offered what I see as an interesting take on a question we don't ask enough, which is how influential can the middle and smaller countries be? And particularly I wanted to look at Australia. To answer that rigorously, I had to build what I saw as a kind of strong academic framework, trying to identify exactly what type of a country Australia is, and I just call it a middle power and look at what exactly that means. And also the way that influence works, and particularly the way that ideas change and therefore the kind of policies that countries conduct change. Using this idea of norm entrepreneurship, so the promotion of ideas, values, standards of behaviour. And what I really wanted to see was how was there any evidence that Australia had persuaded other countries in this region to adopt similar ideas and policies on some of its most important issues, so weapons of mass destruction, asylum seekers, and trade. And they make up the three main case studies.
And just before we move on, who's the book aimed at?
So it is an academic book first and foremost, but I've tried to write it in what I see as publicly engaging a style as possible. So if you've read a little bit about international affairs or you kind of follow the news on Australian foreign policy, you'll find much here that you can easily dive into. There is a conceptual framework chapter at the start, but that can happily be skipped without too much loss of challenge. And certainly a lot of the ideas in it, such as Australia being a middle power or promoting ideas, are actually quite common in a lot of our public discussions of these things. So I'm hopeful that the general public will see a lot of interest in this, as well as scholars or students of Australian foreign policy.
Yeah, and I would also like to promote the book to the general public as well. I did find the book quite, as you state, you can skip the chapter on conceptual framework, and I did read it because I was reviewing the book and I wanted to understand the material, but I would perfectly understand why the more general reader would do that. Just sort of shifting along and sort of dealing with the conceptual framework of the book. And one of the comments you made in the book I found interesting and was that, we used to sort of think of how powerful a country was based on the abundance of natural resources. But, since the 90s, we've been moving toward state actors or behavioural norms. So can you just briefly outline how that shift came about and why the measure of natural resources as a measure of a country's sort of influence is outdated?
Sure. Now, academics still widely debate how to actually identify who's powerful in international affairs, and we kind of form ourselves into little tribes and groups based on our kind of basic assumptions about how the world works. While this certainly is kind of a tribal debate within academia, I think there has been a general trend over the last 20 to 30 years to say that while natural resources and economic wealth is still the foundation of international power, no one is kind of taking away from its importance, but just recognizing that just having dollars in your pocket doesn't actually make you influential. It's also driven by ideas about what you should spend it on, ideas about who is a friend and who is a foe, ideas about what is the right way to act in international politics. And it's these kind of implicit, not formalized norms of behavior that are often vital for determining who is actually significant, who countries focus on, how countries organize their military capacity, what kind of a military capacity they choose. Just having a large bank account doesn't enable you, doesn't kind of, or looking at a map doesn't tell you exactly what the right answer to these questions are. We have situations where the United States, for most of the last 50 years, has been worried about tiny little Cuba, just off a tiny island, just off its coast, while happily engaging with Canada, which is a much larger, resource-rich middle power to its north. North Korea is a tiny, impoverished country, yet it constantly has the world running to focus on it. And Israel manages to dictate policy to the United States, and Taiwan seems to continue eluding the grasp of China. Now, to understand how these countries have been able to achieve influence, achieve their national interest in a way that doesn't just go to the size of their bank account, scholars have recognized we need to go beyond counting up guns and butter. As important as that is, it's also important to look at what ideas nations have about how to choose what guns and butter they buy, and how that then translates into actually having influence in international affairs.
And just briefly, I know this is chucking into the bus slightly, but when I was reading or thinking about, the sort of shift you were just talking about, one country that sprang to mind, of all places, it's actually Saudi Arabia, just because they're very, the rich in natural resource in terms of oil, but if you actually look at that country, they don't particularly, for a country of its wealth, they don't particularly have a particularly strong military, for instance. So do you think Saudi Arabia in some ways sort of, almost backwards way from what you described, fits that into that, what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think that's a very good example. If people buy military equipment, we know that in the end that tends to translate into political effectiveness. But some purchases are more effective, and some countries are more effective at translating what often quite limited military capacity they have, or economic capacity or diplomatic capacity, into actually achieving what they want to do so. And it's that translation between the kind of real world objects that you buy with your resource and other wealth, and then the kind of political outcomes that you're seeking. And some countries are much better at making that translation as kind of cost-free, as friction-free. And I think Saudi Arabia is a great example of it. Singapore is another fantastic example. Very small, kind of tiny little island, only about 5 million people, and yet has had quite a significant impact in the way that Southeast Asia has operated and developed, because they've been able to try and make that translation as effective as possible. And I think this is a very important question at a time of changing regional dynamics in terms of the growing economic wealth of countries, that if we assume too simplistically that more money means greater influence, we don't quite understand why China and India perhaps aren't quite dominating in the way that some people thought they might, why the US continues to be significant. But we also miss how some countries are doing more with that growing wealth than others, and what impact that is going to be. So there's a lot of capacity for different outcomes rather than just straight kind of league tables of income. None of this is to downplay the importance of being able to have the capacity to buy aircraft carriers and nuclear weapons, but it's also about what you're going to do with that, and how and why these might be the right tools for you that really matters for states trying to achieve their national interests.
And just before I move on, I just want to state on air that you cited the case of Singapore, and I think, you could write an entire book on Singapore as a case study, just because, I first heard about the fall of Singapore in World War II when I was a kid, and when you look at what Singapore was like that when it was a British colonial possession, and what Singapore is today in the space of, it's now been over 70 years, and the transformation is remarkable to say the least. But I do need to, shift things along, and just the following sort of questions I am trying to sort of get at the aim of your book. And that's what I decided to do when I wrote these questions. So unfortunately, I'm probably not going to be able to go into the details of the Bali process on air, just because, we could spend 3 or 4 hours discussing your book and not cover it all. Mm-hmm. It's the nature of the subject matter. So
hopefully encourages people to buy the book, eh?
Yeah, exactly. So I would say to the reader, go out and buy the book. It is worth buying, put it on your shelf or your Kindle e-reader. So the question is, speaking of the Bali process, this next question is in two parts. So I think I'll do probably part one first. In 2003, a boat carrying Vietnamese boat people arrived off the coast of Western Australia. Could you inform the listener how the situation was handled different from the Tampa affair in 2001?
Sure. So these are, I think, great examples of the way that the Australian government thought about the problem of what I call irregular migration, or asylum seekers. It's the kind of common debate and discussion here in Australia. And in 2001, we had a government which was facing rapid growth in the numbers that were arriving. Now, at the time, it was only about 2,000 to 3,000 people per year, but this was unprecedented, and it looked like Australia wasn't able to control its borders, to manage its migration process, to really be in control of what it was seen as the basic processes. And so you had this quite extraordinary situation where a boat carrying asylum seekers to Australia sunk. The people on board were picked up by a Norwegian vessel, the MV Tampa, and when it tried to move towards Australia, as it was kind of happened to be transiting through between there, it was refused access. And this led to a diplomatic standoff. And from the Australian government's point of view, what they were trying to do was say that we weren't going to just allow this trade to continue, to people just continuing coming into the country. This was part of what they saw was a security problem for the country. They saw it as a whole range of migration problems. Certainly as well, it was also a domestic political problem for the Howard government at the time. It's an amazing standoff with it. And there were a number of other kind of examples around that period where they tried to turn boats back, where they tried to do everything they could to simply stop this occurring, partly because I think they saw themselves as operating on their own basis. Now, fast forward to 2003, after the Bali process has been set up, after you start to have regional governments recognizing that irregular migration is a significant issue, that they needed to cooperate on this, and they needed to set up new ways to deal with this that didn't just kind of leave some countries as kind of having to deal with the problem. So in 2003, you have these boat-carrying Vietnamese asylum seekers reaching the West Australian coast, so a lot closer than we have with Tampa. But in this case, the government's attitude had completely changed. The flow of asylum seekers had pretty much dropped off in 2002. And by 2003, our government was willing to praise Indonesia for its cooperation and support, noting that this is just isolated, and really downplaying the significance of it as compared to how they'd acted in 2001. And they did that because they were under the belief that regional attitudes had started to change, that regional cooperation was starting to emerge. And I think a big reason for that is because in late 2001, early 2002, Australia went to the region and said, we need to change the way we think about these issues, and they were successfully able to do so. And that's still having flow-on and ramification effects to this day.
And the second part of the question is, and you've alluded to it in that, Australia was able to change attitudes in the region. So how does that represent the Australian government taking the rare step of establishing a new policy framework?
So I describe this as a case of normal entrepreneurship. For a long time, questions about cooperative security in Southeast Asia, and the Keating government had really pushed this through, as had the ASEAN institution and many regional governments, seeing this as a good way to cooperate. And what the Howard government managed to achieve in 2001-2 was to try and say, well, irregular migration is part of these non-traditional threats that everybody thinks we should cooperate on. So it said, I've got an issue that's important to Australia. You're all looking for ways to cooperate on more easily dealt with problems, that this is a regional problem rather than just a specific problem to one country. And in that way, created frameworks, created institutions that were able to start dealing with this problem and getting countries in the region to put serious resources and time to do so. Now, the real key to our success here was, not how good our small talk was at diplomatic parties. It's the fact that we went to Indonesia and we said, you are the acknowledged regional leader. And if you accept these ideas, then that will help the rest of the region get on board with these ideas. And you need to deal with this problem because there's a significant amount of irregular migration through Indonesia, far, far larger than Australia's ever faced, but they didn't consider it a priority. And we encouraged them to see it as a priority. We gave them support and assistance, and Indonesia, to their credit, given this was only just a year or two after the end of East Timor and all the controversy that had come through that, Indonesia was willing to do this for Australia. And that made a big difference in allowing our ideas to get a fair hearing. And so this Bali process has been set up to try and continue that process of learning how to deal with irregular migration, the best police and intelligence tactics, the best migratory and kind of processing tactics, and understanding and viewing this as a regional approach, and therefore seeing policy changes in the way the governments in the region operate.
And although it relates to the Bali process, does Alexander Downer's statement on page 106 not serve as a sort of telling statement for anybody who wants to study international relations? And I'm just going to read out Alexander Downer's statement. Indonesia doesn't want to be told what to do by Western countries, so if you want to achieve things with Indonesia, you want to be very careful not to claim credit for them. The whole Bali process was put together by me, and the pronunciation's nasty there, sorry. The Indonesian... Oh, thank you very much. That was a save. That was like a life jacket. The Indonesian foreign minister at the time. And Bali is in Indonesia, so they hosted it. So obviously I would have been very sensitive to all of these factors. As I often say, don't go into government if your aim is to claim credit.
So Alexander Downer's comment, I think, is a very good one, because it goes to Australia trying to learn how to engage with its region. For a long time, we've kind of seen ourselves as quite different, as more wealthy, more developed, better understanding how to actually do the process of government and engagement of governments to try and achieve outcomes. And yet that kind of hubris has also then led us into a number of failures where we should have achieved a lot more, we should have had a lot more influence, and trying to manage that kind of change, especially as countries such as Indonesia and others have moved out of colonization and have become a lot more developed and a lot more capable and now more democratic, has been a real challenge and real important part of the last 30 years. And that's something that we're still trying to get right. But it also carries with it some interesting kind of side effects. I think the Bali process is one of the kind of great unacknowledged stories of Australian foreign policy in the last 20 years, and yet it hasn't been talked about. And partly that's because we like to think of this as an issue, irregular migration, one that we can solve ourselves, and certainly the Howard government wanted to play up that attitude of being able to solve it themselves and the strength that seems to come from that. But we also had a regional kind of caution about how much we could actually say was going on, whether we could kind of claim any authority or ownership, kind of fatherhood for the process, when Indonesia was being the public face for it and helping to lead it. So managing these regional relationships sometimes means taking a back step in terms of credit in order to actually achieve the policy outcomes we want. But unfortunately, unless the public are paying close attention, they might miss exactly what the government's doing. And I think that's partly what's happened here in regular migration.
And I just want to, before we move on, I just want to touch on to the aspect of how easy it is for the public to miss such things. I saw Alexander Downer interviewed about the issue of boat people, and I think it was around the time of Gillard or Rudd governments when, the problem had sort of cropped up again on the public's radar. And one of the things that struck me, he said, was that, during the Howard government, they turned back the boats, but, and they had the cooperation of Indonesia, but they just didn't say anything publicly because they didn't want to alienate Indonesia. So doesn't that sort of fit in with what you were talking about? And I don't want to get too much into the Abbott government because it's too contemporary, but surely that's a crucial lesson there.
Yeah, very, very much so. And this is one of the real problems of doing foreign policy issues when there is big public kind of perceptions and interests involved in it, and trying to manage that challenge. Sometimes governments will play up to a public audience at home, possibly at the cost of kind of regional effectiveness. At the same time, I think the Abbott government has proven that while Indonesia, I think, is vital for stopping the problem of irregular migration, the Indonesian government isn't also going to suddenly kind of unleash 10,000 votes in our direction if they're annoyed at us. So Indonesia has its own interests that it's trying to pursue, and they may not always align with what Australia is trying to do. It has its own ideas about what is the right way to deal with this. And what the Howard government was trying to do was set up some form of regional ideas that they thought would be effective, but also adding to it with kind of Australian domestic ideas. And what in Australia we've tended to play up and talk about those domestic parts. The Abbott government seems to have proven them reasonably effective, but there's a lot else that's gone on in terms of why and how we've tried to manage, and particularly the influence that we've been able to have in changing and elevating the importance of these issues that might long-term be quite significant.
Yeah, I think it's now time to move on to the topic of stopping the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and that was I found that chapter to be I learnt a lot from it. I consider myself to be reasonably clued on about international relations, and I found it I found it to be very informative, and I also liked that Iraq wasn't the elephant in the room that it could have been in the book. I do have different thoughts on Iraq, but that's playing out now as we speak, basically. So, that's for another discussion. But just to sort of kick us off, though, in this topical area, does the Treaty of Rarotonga, which is more commonly known as the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone, in layman's terms represent the Hawke's government way of answering the anti-nuclear public sentiment and demands of the South Pacific governments at the time, while trading on its good relations with the Reagan administration?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. The Hawke government came to office in 1983 promising to pursue a nuclear-free zone in its region. And this was an idea that had been kind of bouncing around the South Pacific for a number of years. The Treaty of Rarotonga was one of the first and is seen as having had quite a lot of impact on influencing the Southeast Asian nuclear-free zone and leading to the spread of these ideas around the world. We haven't seen as much of them in kind of the last decade or so, but they were a way of expressing concern and reluctance to be drawn into what were the final stages of the kind of Cold War confrontation. This was an idea which the South Pacific countries were much more kind of hardline than we were willing to be, and certainly much more hardline than the Hawke government was willing to be. There was parts of the Australian population that were aghast at Australia having any influence in relation to nuclear weapons and the transmit of nuclear material. The Hawke government wanted to walk more of a middle line. And so it tried to pursue this treaty, which it saw as a good thing, as an expression of its values and its concerns. It saw as a way of contributing to regional non-proliferation. But at the same time, it needed to keep its good relationship with the Reagan administration. And the US wasn't happy with this. The US saw these kinds of ideas as quite dangerous. It thought that they could prevent its freedom of navigation at sea and freedom of movement. They saw these as potentially supporting Soviet claims and Soviet arguments about who was responsible and who was causing harm in it. And we saw the real demonstration of US concern with this when in 1984, the land government in New Zealand said, we're not going to allow United States vessels to come into our ports without them telling us if they've got nuclear material, nuclear fission on board. And when the US refused to do so, there was a breakdown and a kind of virtual ending of those useful consonants in the ANZUS alliance. New Zealand was effectively kicked out or its term suspended by the United States, security guarantees suspended, and Australia certainly had no desire to see this similar kind of basis going. And so the Hawke government had to walk a middle line between the kind of hardline anti-nuclear views of the region and the kind of great skepticism about this concept by the United States. It could have easily abandoned it, but I think to its credit, it managed to achieve quite a significant treaty and quite a demonstration of what a smaller country like Australia can do, kind of in between the very small and the very big.
Just before I move on to the sort of second part of this question, I just want to point out to the listener that in the written review that's going to accompany this discussion, I do give my views on the Longer government's actions, and it's suffice to say I'm not particularly fond of them. But that is for the written review, and I am, again, I have to factor in time that, there's other topics that I need to cover during this excellent discussion with you, but
I'll be fascinated to read your review.
yes, but the one thing I would say before I'm moving on, though, is that while I have no natural political inclinations towards Labor, I do think that people can learn a lot from the Hawke government's actions in both, it's for the anti-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and what we will talk about later on in the program, trade liberalisation. I certainly think that, using intellect instead of just purely ideological motives is something that I think we should applaud in our political leaders. But I do need to move on to the second part of this question, and this for me is actually quite the meaty part of the Treaty of Rarotonga. How much does the lack of enforcement clauses in the treaty speak of the limits on Australian influence and power and the actual desire to enforce the treaty?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and that really does get to the heart of it. The Treaty of Rarotonga is seen as kind of a good first mover in this regard, but it's also one of the weakest of these treaties. And I think, unfortunately, this does show the limitation, especially at the time, kind of the early 1980s, when the Hawke government was trying to push ahead with this idea. One of the interesting things I was able to kind of discover by doing this book and trying to look at 30 years of Australia trying to advance non-proliferation ideas, not just kind of one government or one particular moment, was the way that our views about what was possible and where we could be influential has changed. So during the Hawke government, part of the Cold War, you very much had a view that Australia could only deal with kind of non-proliferation, that it was only stopping the further spread, and really we were going to struggle to even stop countries with weapons testing, moving equipment, doing anything more than they saw as their right and purpose. We just wanted to stop other countries kind of getting to it. During the post-Cold War period, you have this interesting debate that kind of crops up with the Keating government, however, talking about, well, can we actually now start talking about disarmament? That is the kind of countries getting rid of their nuclear weapons, countries abandoning having chemical weapons capacity or biological weapons capacity and moving away from these kinds of resources. And that's a debate that continues to this day. It ebbs and flows over different governments and different ideological inclinations play into it. But ultimately, Australia has been able to have a very significant influence in terms of non-proliferation. Its record is still quite slight on disarmament, but that's also true of the United States and the rest of the world. So it's probably not to our great harm or shame that we haven't been able to have that influence.
And just before I move on, I think it is worth making one note to the listener, and you can give your thoughts on it briefly. When the Hawke government got elected in 1983, no one could foresee the end of the Cold War. I mean, today we know the Berlin Wall comes down in 89, but do you think that is, fair to say that within the times the Hawke government was working in, there was no real foreseeable end to the Soviet Union?
Yeah, exactly. You have to judge their kind of involvement and achievements at the time. And that also partly explains the kind of Keating government's, what are now seen as kind of naive or utopian claims about ridding the world of nuclear weapons. Because that was suddenly the post-Cold War era, and suddenly the world had radically changed. We had the end of history. We had that sense that people had escaped nuclear Armageddon and now could sensibly try and move away from that. Those were, if you judge them in the circumstances, I think they're much more kind of serious and noble achievements. And, I guess the policymakers today can only hope that future historians will judge them in the same light.
Yeah, I hope that historians do judge them in the same light as well. And you've mentioned the Keating government, which is, a great lead into this next question. In the field of countering weapons of mass destruction proliferation, in the abstract of Australian foreign policy, just how much was the Canberra Commission and the Keating government stance on the issue of combating nuclear proliferation a bump in the road?
Look, I think the Canberra Commission is kind of one of the great what-ifs of Australian foreign policy. It was very well put together in terms of getting some quite senior voices in America and from around the world to deal with this issue. to have a government really lead a promotion of new ideas and new ways of thinking about a major issue. And by that time, Australia had firmly established itself as one of the leading world voices on non-proliferation and WMD, which is quite remarkable given our lack of actual nuclear weapons and a major nuclear industry at the time. And yet, because of the timing of the Keating government being kind of tired by the end of their many years in power, and the Howard government coming in 1996, you unfortunately have the kind of Commission's work and effort being somewhat redirected and then kind of buried at birth. And so it doesn't really get the promotion and advocacy that it perhaps could have. Other countries at the time tried to actually step in and advance it when Australia was seen to be AWOL, such as Sweden and Brazil. And I think I tend to agree with Alexander Downer that it probably wouldn't have had a great impact. It probably wouldn't have changed things. We've seen similar kind of idealism from US presidents and others. But at the same time, it really is a great what if in terms of just what could it have achieved and setting up the kind of intellectual framework for thinking about these issues in a new kind of way.
And I think you're right about the sort of intellectual way of thinking about the issues. I think if there was an opportunity missed there, it was that people like Robert McNamara didn't spend more time in Australia talking about nuclear weapons and his time as Secretary of Defence during the Vietnam War. I don't want to touch on McNamara and the other people that were involved in the Canberra Commission any further, just because they, when they served, falls generally outside of the scope of your book. So unless you want to comment on that further, I will just shift us on.
And I just want to make one, final point on that is that nuclear weapons are a great way of kind of understanding the way that ideas influence international politics. If we think that every country just wants to get as much power for itself as possible, then we can't really explain why countries don't all seek nuclear weapons and why we've only seen very limited amounts of proliferation worldwide. And it's partly because of ideas about whether it's right or acceptable or moral to have nuclear weapons. It's partly about whether nuclear weapons are even useful. How and what kind of circumstances might you use them? So they're a good way of demonstrating that just because you have the amount of resources and money to develop a nuclear weapon capacity, and Australia certainly does, that doesn't always mean that's the best option for you. And when you look at a country like North Korea that has become an international pariah, in part because of its pursuit of nuclear weapons, you can see just the influence and importance of ideas in the way that international politics operates. It's not just the strong doing whatever they can. Ideas matter, and I think nuclear weapons prove that more than anything else.
You won't get any argument from me on that. I think that's probably the best summary I've heard on the importance of nuclear weapons. And there was a very interesting statement from the former Australian Prime Minister Gareth Evans, and I think it's on page 146 in the electronic version of the book I was reading, and I'm going to read it out on air. And it's just one of those parts of the book that struck me. What we were pushing with disarmament, what we were pushing is non-proliferation. What we're pushing is the peaceful use of nuclear energy in a way that doesn't contribute to further proliferation. We're pushing policy objectives which are manifestly defensible and desirable in their own right, and not for any larger conceptual reason, but simply to enhance global security. Now, this statement is, it needs to be seen in the backdrop of the Canberra Commission's approach of, that you need to remove nuclear weapons in order to stop proliferation. So, what do you make of that?
Well, this was fascinating when Gareth told me this, and this was I'd asked him about, was Australia a normal entrepreneur? That is the kind of framework that I'd set up for it. And he understood the term well and thought that, it perhaps applied to some of his work on the responsibility to protect, where he's been one of the leading world voices in advancing that new norm. He was less certain that it applied to what he saw they were trying to do, or at least he kind of didn't want that to be the way that his actions and the government actions were judged, because they were political leaders rather than, say, intellectual leaders. They had responsibilities to the Australian public who had elected them. They had policy responsibilities to achieve practical changes during their term of office and set up practical changes for the future that would benefit Australia and its national interest. And I think this is very important, that while I may kind of look at the record and try and judge countries as normal entrepreneurs and other academics, and I hope the general public kind of get into this debate about can countries produce ideas, that's not how our politicians often see what their role and responsibility is. They may have different goals and values, and they may try and judge their actions and results on slightly different criteria. And that's just important for kind of understanding what they're trying to do. You know, I think the general public might be rightly skeptical if a politician came to them and said, I'm going to go and spend your money and you've elected me here so that I can go and change the views of foreigners about important issues. You know, the public would wonder what the benefit was. So you'd see politicians acting in different ways, and I think that's what Gareth is kind of reflecting there. But perhaps we can read into it other outcomes at least.
Well, one of the comments I make in the written review that I will be posting with the program is that the Australia group, which was what I think was a sort of lobby group aimed at getting the Chemical Weapons Convention sort of signed or ratified, that was very well done on Australia's part because, they used the Australian Embassy in Paris as a meeting point, which meant that the Australian taxpayer, who, you were kind of alluding to just a moment ago, didn't really have to fork out a lot for those diplomatic efforts.
And even better, it kind of gave us the home ground advantage. These little things can matter in international politics, and we were able to kind of claim the authority of hosting it and pushing it. And, when people are on your turf, that makes it easier for you to help persuade them to see your ideas and see your views. So, yeah, it was a kind of very smart piece of diplomacy there.
It's items like that in the book why I hope that anyone who aspires to be a politician reads the book, because while I know I claim that New Zealand is a middle power, I would say that, New Zealand could conceivably in the future use one of its embassies overseas to host such a meeting. I mean, that is within the realms of what we could achieve. And, if someone can pick up this book, even if it is a current politician, even our current foreign minister, and see that that has been done, that in itself is, it's a very important legacy. But I need to move on to trade liberalisation. And the first thing I'd just like to say, just to be a bit lighthearted, when I started reading about APEC in the book, it reminded me of how I first went to APEC when I was a kid. I have vague memories of seeing the leaders on TV following the tradition of wearing the fashions of the host country of the day. That seems to be my first memories of APEC.
I think this is APEC's smartest move ever. Everybody remembers those shirts. Everybody knows that they exist. It's just genius. And who doesn't love to mock their politicians as well? So
yes, it's almost as good as the time. I think it was in Singapore, Malaysia. Alexander Downer was singing.
Well, I think thankfully for our ears we don't have that regularly, but
but now just moving back into the serious aspect of APEC, and did the occasion of the APEC Forum represent the importance of the Australian government being able to step up to the plate and weld existing policy to suit Australia while promoting free trade in Asia?
Yeah, I think APEC is rightly one of the celebrated kind of cases of Australian kind of creative diplomacy. It's an interesting story in that it tells us the importance of having regional partners for this effort. The idea for APEC had been around in various forms and been kind of advanced by scholars and academics and kind of policy wonks here in Australia, but also as well in Japan in their big ministries. And the Japanese were feeling somewhat limited in their capacity to advance this idea. Great powers often feel quite constrained in what they can say and cautious about how others are going to respond to their more creative or innovative or radical ideas. Australia, however, was able to partner with Japan to kind of see their common interest in this kind of a trade forum and lead the charge for it and be the public face for it, advocate it. And by that time, we'd started to kind of demonstrate our credibility on this issue. It started to demonstrate that we were a serious player despite our small size because of changes that we'd been making at home. And the Hawke government genuinely believed that greater free trade would be good for Australia first and foremost, but then also good for the region. So this was about core national interest, but it was certainly something that they saw as contributing to the well-being of the region. and not just in terms of wealth, but having that interconnections of trade leading to a more stable and more secure relationship and kind of locking in the peace that they had. This is a prime example of what they saw as how you win the peace.
And just for the benefit of the general reader, and I include myself in this category who don't have a degree in political science, how would you fit that into the sort of behavioural norms?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. So in the book, I try and split up different kinds of idea advocacy. If you create a new idea yourself or kind of radically change it, as I think we did with irregular migration, I've labelled that norm entrepreneurship, kind of taking a new idea and leading it out to the world. And the founder of organisations such as Greenpeace or the Red Cross are famous examples. People who've had a bold new idea and want to share it with the rest of the world. But a lot of ideas that we think are very good and perhaps should be adopted more widely are already widely available, but they need someone to help diffuse them, to help stabilize them. So I've come up with these other terms: norm diffusers, norm stabilizers, those kind of power engines to help lead an idea from being a minority concept to being something that the majority of people or majority of countries think is an important idea and the right idea for them and their circumstances. Trade liberalisation is obviously a very old idea. It's been around for a long time. It's been advocated in a lot of different places. The Hawke government of Australia didn't come up with the idea of having free trade and trade liberalisation. But what we did do is say that this is an idea that we think everybody should adopt. We think it'll make them wealthier. We think it'll make us wealthier. We think it'll make everybody more secure. It's the right way that countries should act in terms of not having barriers to trade. And we wanted to help spread that idea through the creation of new forums, through building kind of engagement and policy skills in the region, through persuading other countries that this was the right kind of behaviour. And our leaders did this consistently and continually and have done so for the last 30 years at least.
Yeah, and one of the things I found when I was reading parts of your book that talk about the behavioural norms, I sort of started to think of it in terms of what you see in society, and just to kind of put this out there to the reader, how they may want to consider it. Like, I considered the behavioural norms within the issue of, say, gay rights, just to use an example to the listener. Now, I'm not going to bring that up as a topic here, but to use it as an example, if we go back to the 70s, the idea of gay rights sort of starts to emerge. Then you say you spend a particular time period in New Zealand, say up to the passage of gay marriage, to keep this short. You might say it's the debating period, and then you have it as as a norm. And do you think, though, without getting too far off track, that is a reasonable way of approaching it?
Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it. Norms are everywhere in the world. The fact that we all wear clothes, that we don't talk when someone else is talking, the fact that, we believe certain kinds of actions are appropriate or not appropriate. These are based on norms, standards of acceptable behaviour. Some of these we write down, but what's more important is not that we write them down, but that everybody, or the vast majority of people in a society, agree this is the right way to act. And I think these kind of informal constructs and concepts are vitally important for how societies operate. And, same-sex marriage is a perfect example where you've seen a quite radical change in the way that the public views acceptable conduct, that it doesn't seem to have a problem with that, and the law is kind of having to race and check to kind of keep up. And no amount of laws is able to actually prevent these changes in popular opinion taking place and changing the right kind of attitudes. And if people accept common norms and common ideas about the right kind of way to behave, then it's much easier for countries to engage. It's much easier for countries to interact and do useful deals, either strategic ones or political ones or economic ones, and to develop regional architecture and infrastructure that serves their needs. So it's partly kind of trying to promote our values as it's seen, but also trying to come to some kind of common understanding of how to interact. And these are often the real forces that drive the world in many ways.
And I must admit too, I didn't know about the CAMS group before I read the book, which is, something that, it's just another case of, how informative I found the book. And how much I learned from it. But on the Cairns group, did the Cairns group demonstrate how Australia could raise the matter of agricultural tariffs, without going sort of unilaterally to Europe and the USA?
Yeah, the Cairns Group's a fascinating kind of example. We've been talking a little bit about institutions here, Bali Process and APEC before, and the Cairns Group is really an advocacy group. It was a range of countries that had similar kind of agricultural primary industry backgrounds. Argentina, Brazil, New Zealand, Colombia, Indonesia, Uruguay, and others that wanted to see a different approach to agricultural tariffs. And they realized that they were all small or middle power countries and that they wouldn't get heard in the real discussion which occurred between the United States and the European Union, or the big European countries at the time. And so formed into this advocacy group. And again, Australia was able to kind of quite audaciously say, hey, why don't you come all down to the Cairns? It's nice and sunny and a good place to meet. And in that way, kind of adopt leadership of the group and kind of push it forward. And that let us push it for issues that we were more concerned about. But by kind of having this strength in numbers, this coalition building, the Cairns Group was able to achieve kind of putting agricultural trade issues onto the agenda at what was kind of then the GATT, now the World Trade Organization, the WTO, kind of big debates in Uruguay, and forcing America to take this seriously. Unfortunately, it hasn't achieved as much as it perhaps could. It still continues in the many years since the 1993 breakthrough. But it is a great example that when they do coalesce and come together, small and middle power countries can actually use their collective weight to achieve breakthroughs. That's a lot talked about by international relations scholars, but the examples of it are quite rare, and the Cairns Group is perhaps one of the best examples of it.
And it's also worth noting, just to the listener who lives in Australia and New Zealand, particularly in New Zealand where, we have a thriving dairy industry, that the matter of agricultural tariffs in countries like the United States, Japan, and I believe even South Korea is still a hot political topic, and it's not something that political leaders in those countries have been particularly willing to touch, from what I've read over the years. So that kind of puts in perspective on just what the Cairns Group managed to achieve. And these next questions sort of look a bit to the future as well. And I think, what I found, particularly when I was reading your conclusions in the book, and I found inevitably that I was thinking about the future. But before we get to your conclusions, I think it's worth taking this direction. For the benefit of future Australian political leaders who don't have the good fortune of the timing pocket or education of APEC, and they still want to act as an open batsman, to use Australian, to put it in an Australian way, what would you tell them? Or put another way, how do you avoid a rerun of Kevin Rudd's failed Asia-Pacific Community proposal?
Sure. So you had Kevin Rudd in 2008, this new ambitious Australian Prime Minister who had a long background in foreign policy and was kind of widely believed to be an expert in it. And he proposed what he saw as kind of a gap in the market. It wasn't a big forum where the United States and China could come and sit down and talk about the big issues. And like every good Australian leader, he had his own motive for it, and he wanted Australia to have a seat at that table, and part of the way was proposing it. Unfortunately, this idea fell flat. In fact, it was really an embarrassment, kind of in the way that it was advanced in the end result. Rudd had to eventually kind of pull the idea out of circulation, say, no, we're not doing that, and kind of apologise to the region for how he did it. And that's quite telling compared to, say, the kind of luck and success that Hawke had. And I think there's a number of reasons in it. Partly it was about how Australia goes about developing its ideas, and this is vital for smaller countries. They've got to be clever. They've got to focus on where they can really add and contribute and build the ground for it. So getting the support of other countries quietly beforehand, briefing other countries about what you're trying to do, building that support. In the case of Bali Process, we had Indonesia on board. In APEC, we had Japan, and there really wasn't another big partner ready to help support and kind of promote some of these ideas in it. If I can even be so blunt as to put an Asian face on some of these ideas. And that's, I guess, the second part of what's really changed is that Australia used to be seen as the odd man in of the Asia Pacific. And I guess New Zealand to a degree is as well, that they are quite unlike many countries in the region, They're not bound by some of the kind of cultural and hierarchical norms that often kind of control activism, and that's given them a certain freedom. It's allowed them to be more innovative, a lot more challenging. But now that we are so thoroughly integrated into the region, that idea of kind of standing apart and tossing a kind of new idea into the mix and just seeing where it happens, that's not really accepted as reasonable behaviour anymore. We've got to be much more part of the region, working with the existing forums, the existing institutions, recognising that, we need to build support for these ideas long term rather than just kind of challenging everyone else to respond and then stepping back if it doesn't work that way. So in my conclusion, I argue that we've really seen the end of engagement, that the old trends that used to drive Australian policy over the last 30 years, the years I kind of cover in my book since 1983, those large trends have changed, perhaps even come to an end. And we need to think about how to advance policy in this new era as an integrated and enmeshed part of the region. And that has big legacies and very important implications for policymakers.
I think you're quite right. I think what I'm getting from you there is if an Australian political leader was to say in the future want to set up a regional forum that dealt with the emergence of China as a world power, before you can just go out and make the announcements on the 6 o'clock news, you need the foundations in place. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, very much so. And I think whether another forum is the right way to do with it. I mean, part of the difference is that there's just so many institutions that, because of the political uncertainty and kind of changes since kind of the 80s and into the new kind of post-Cold War era, the world has built a hell of a lot of forums. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, has over 1,000 meetings every year. Big discussions about China. There are a number of major forums: the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Regional Forum, increasingly the Shangri-La Leadership Dialogue, in terms of defence diplomacy. And so recognising just what we would want a new forum to do, just how it might differentiate itself from it and kind of contribute to it, and really having a sense of, is this the best way to go about it? And if you wanted to get that, you'd need to get countries such as China and Indonesia and the United States on board first, but you probably have to start bringing in Japan and India as well and convince them that this was worth their time for already, overworked, over-traveled diplomats and national leaders. We have this virtual summit season in kind of late August and October where the national leaders of major countries in the Asia Pacific are expected to spend 3 or 4 weeks overseas, going to APEC and ASEAN and EAS and G20 might be meeting, or a whole range of meetings like that. So really kind of recognizing the limitations of this process. Unfortunately, I think for too many on the left these days, multilateralism is, or as Michael Wesley once famously put it, it's become the band-aid solution to every problem. And I think we need fresh thinking about the right way forward.
Yes, and I'd just like to touch on what you just said about multilateralism. While I hadn't actually planned on mentioning events in Ukraine and Europe on the air or Iran, I think the sort of sanctions and the approach international community has taken to trying to stop Iran getting a nuclear bomb, same with North Korea, and even Russia's intrusion into the Ukraine would fit into what you're talking about there. But I'm just chucking out that to the listener to think about. But now I'm sort of getting into your conclusions, and they're in chapter 7 in the book. And really, I must say, you really hit on one of my grave concerns that I had before I read the book, although you were able to illustrate it within the behavioural norms. So sort of start off with, I'm going to be frank here and blunt, but does the lack of political will and frankly political correctness handicap the Australian government from acting as a norm stabiliser? Now let me build on this a little bit more, because let me put it in this way. If Australia wants a strong barrier to terrorism, political instability, or you could even say, military threats from north where it's going to come from Asia, doesn't the preventive cure start somewhere like East Timor? And the best preventative cure I've seen to all those things, in modern day history, if you like, was the Marshall Program, which rebuilt Western Europe and Japan after World War II. So even if we had to scale it down, shouldn't this be the basis for Australia to work on, and by extension as a junior partner in New Zealand?
Yeah, here's the interesting kind of tectonic shift in some ways. For a long time, Australia has been very concerned about the strength of its region. We're worried about growing power of Japan at the turn of the century. And it's part of why Australia became a federation. We're worried about Indonesia in the 1960s and confrontasi and communism and these kind of big power challenges that might come through our region and undermine our fundamental national interests. Today, the risk is weakness. It's the reverse. Strong countries around our region are not actually a threat to us. Australia, and I don't want to put words in the mouth of the kind of much more kind of multicultural New Zealand, but Australia and New Zealand have been able to kind of come to grips with the fact that they can be of a different cultural basis, but thoroughly integrated into the region and not a threat just because we are different styles of countries operating in different kinds of ways. And come to realize that it is the strength of our region that is actually our best strength for our long-term protection from, any kind of storms you might see coming from Northeast Asia, economic as well as security conflicts. And particularly now that it's so much easier for non-state actors like terrorism and insurgent groups and others to be able to kind of cause chaos and cause harm, that we need strong countries around ourselves. I actually think the move by the Abbott government to try and more fully integrate aid with Australia's diplomatic capacity by kind of subsuming the AusAid department into the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade is a really sensible way, because we've got to have these often quite limited arms of government in terms of just how much money we can do with these problems, all working towards a couple of core objectives. If we try and do too much, if we're not focused enough, we're not going to be able to achieve much. So I think there needs to be, and there really is a growing sense that what we want is a strong, prosperous, highly developed, secure region around us. And the more that we can help to do that now, it's already rapidly happening, but the more we can help to do that in the start of the 20th century, the better the rest of this century will be for us.
All right, let me just chuck you one grenade before we wrap up. And I've been thinking about this in relation to East Timor quite a bit of late. But let's say, Australia did what was required to make East Timor politically stable, and let's just assume relatively prosperous because of natural gas, if we can, for a moment. Does that not then bring Australia another economic competitor and a competitor potentially to Indonesia? So, in other words, again, to be blunt, is there not really an intent here to keep East Timor weak to avoid potential pitfalls?
I think that's what Australia's been trying to do. I mean, you need to remember that for the last 30 years, our governments have strongly believed in the kind of virtues and values of free trade. And that means open competition between countries, even in the same areas, either leads to better specialisation. So if Australia finds that oil market isn't as good, a small thing, we might move into other areas and have a more productive economy in that fashion. But also, we'd rather an East Timor that is strong and capable and maybe we lose a few dollars competing with, but then we don't have to worry about having to, say, return forces to help them stabilize, about having drugs or asylum seekers or other kinds of non-traditional security threats coming through their border and their issues. So, certainly there are costs to the idea, and part of the, central message I've tried to push through with it is there are trade-offs for doing a lot of these things. Sometimes we need to accept you don't get as much credit, that we might need to act in a way that serves regional interests as much as our own. But and not just try and look at this in terms of just getting short-term advantage now for Australia. We are part of an integrated region, and our security and wealth of the last 30 years has come through accepting that and opening up to the region, accepting that there will be some jobs and other opportunities that go offshore. But long term, this is the right move for Australia, and it makes Australia better off. Right? We're not doing it out of kind of just goodwill for everyone else. It makes Australia better off. And I think we've been very successful at pushing that, but we still have to keep reminding the general public of these arguments and explaining why they are the right arguments, because it is otherwise too easy to kind of see this in a zero-sum fashion. And I don't think that's how the world needs to work, and I don't think it's how the world does work.
Well, thank you very much for joining us on the couch here in the Lens of History studio. I've had an absolute pleasure talking with you about your book.
And thank you very much for the opportunity.
Yeah, and just before we leave it, do you have a website or any social media accounts you'd like to plug?
Sure, you can grab me on Twitter at @AOCarr, or I post some of my book reviews at andrewcarr.org. I am an ANU scholar, so there's certainly a page up on the ANU's website at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre. But thank you very much for the opportunity to have a chat.
You have been listening